Good morning, you guys. Thank you for joining us for our professional development workshop today on understanding the sociopolitical context of multicultural education. In front of you, you guys have an agenda, an outline, in addition to guided questions that we'll be using throughout the presentation. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Howlett, and I'm happy to be here with you guys today. So, for today's agenda, we're going to have a couple objectives that we're going to be looking at, and the first one is exploring how societal and educational structures, policies, and practices affect student learning, which I'm sure you all have experienced sometime in your classroom. And finally, we know that together as teachers, we can provide high-quality education in spite of many obstacles that may get in the way. So as we start this morning, we're going to start with a discussion question that asks you guys why some students succeed academically while others fell. So I want you to ponder that question and take a second to discuss maybe with your neighbor why you think some students succeed while others fell academically. Okay. I think language barriers. Lack of motivation.
Socioeconomic problems.
Motivation. I know some students have parents that are deported and they have a lot of problems at home. They may not be. Okay, so finances. Yeah, many of them are working, and so they're working outside hours. So they'll be able to juggle studying plus taking care of
Their family distractions.
Yeah, that's it, family distractions, because I know that I had a student last year, her father was deported, and she was handling family business, having to pay the workers, having to, she had to interpret for a mother who doesn't speak English. All right, sounds like we have some really important discussion going on. If I could just get a couple people maybe to share out why some students succeed and why some fell. Any good answers out there that you want to share? Mr. Meladaris.
Motivation. Some students just lack the motivation to succeed. They either don't get it at home, they never really kind of learned it on their own, or they just don't want to do it, period.
Okay, so intrinsic, internal motivation. Good. Any other?
Socioeconomic stuff, basically.
Okay.
Poor families, uneducated or really not focused on education, they're more engaged in surviving.
Right, so the priority list, what's important in education kind of falls short on the list of importance.
Exactly.
That's great, we're gonna talk more about that today. Any other last thoughts?
I think there's a lack of confidence on their part. They don't know how to study. And then there's a lack of confidence, which goes into lack of motivation because they don't have that confidence.
Right, so if they're unconfident in school, what are some reasons that you, in your classroom, that you would think a kid could lack confidence?
They don't feel like they can answer the question correctly. They don't want to put themselves out there to
Right.
be ridiculed.
So scared to fail, so it's easier.
Past failure.
All right. Okay, that's great, and I think we're all on the same page. As we move forward in this presentation, we're going to look more specifically at some of those keys that are to unlocking how we can help students succeed in that context. Okay, so as we look at ourselves as teachers, we have to look at ourselves as visionaries, because we have not only the ability, but a duty or obligation in a classroom to promote social justice and equity in our classroom. So how can we do that? They're kind of like untangible terms. You can't really, defining justice or social equity is really hard. We understand that they're good concepts, but to really promote them in our classrooms is a difficult task, and hopefully today, as we go through this presentation, we'll find some more ways that we can do that together. Okay, so to understand the context, these are what we're going to be doing in the presentation specifically, are these 5 items on the agenda. The first one is to clarify the goals and keys. Okay, so before we can say what we're going to accomplish, we have to know what they really are. What is social equity? What is social justice? How are they different? The second one is dissolving myths. We know that there are, especially our school has a high population of low socioeconomic students and immigrants, and we have to dissolve some myths that come along with that understanding as the United States trends into a different immigration system than that of the past. The third is identify the social, economic, political, and ideological issues that surround the context of helping students achieve social equity and justice in classrooms. We're going to encounter a lot of issues that we have been experiencing. For those of you who have been teaching long, have experienced them longer than others. The fourth is to understand the current demographics. As history teachers, we always find those kind of numbers intriguing to see who and what we are teaching. Finally, examine the political struggles. As we all know, legislation and policy does affect us in our classroom, and how that is to either our detriment or our benefit as teachers. Okay, so as we start, we're looking at the goals. This is also in your handout if you're referring to it. Okay, the first one is to tackle inequality by promoting access to an equal education. As you know, this is easier said than done. We can't just say, oh, I'm going to give everybody an equal education. There's lots of barriers. We've talked about some of those barriers that enter into our classroom. Okay, we know that that's the first goal. So we know that we want to achieve this, but how are we going to do it? Okay, the second one is raising the achievement of all students by providing them with an equitable and high quality education. Students are going to come to us at different levels of learning and abilities, and because of that, they are going to have different struggles at achieving this high quality education, and what can we do as educators to help them achieve that education. And the final and third goal is to provide students with every opportunity that's possible to become critical and productive members of a democratic society. As a group of history teachers, we can all agree that that is an important facet that we're providing our students. So as we look forward, we're going to use these three goals to kind of shape and mold what we need to be doing in our classrooms. Okay, knowing that those are your three goals, I need you to tell me and your neighbor, what support do you need to achieve these goals? So if I tell you that you have to achieve these three things, to promote an equal education, to rise the achievement of all students, and to provide them with opportunities, what do you need as a teacher? What kind of support do you need in your classroom?
Support from who?
And that can be open-ended. So it could be from the school, it could be from families, it can be from the government. What support do you need? So go ahead and talk with that to your neighbors, and I'll get Mr. Bell set up. For joining us.
Creating technology that education have access to some sort of electricity.
I would say we need more than one. There's definitely facilitators. You're learning.
Donuts, daily donuts.
Especially
Continuing education, give us new ways so that we don't get stuck in this. I don't like questions, I like answers. Stated and formal.
It is Monday.
We can follow what we
No. One of the problems that I run into frequently is the
ability to hear.
level, the different levels. What my son flagged as an engineer is my comments.
Go ahead.
The problem with that though is with our laws, you have to have.
For students to achieve. Oh, good, that's a good answer. You
You
can
have to teach it.
That's
But
a good answer for schools.
yeah, but I guess.
How do we provide high quality education?
Sorry, I don't know.
This is
So, yeah, I guess you have to use it for statute.
Not in public.
All right. I appreciate how engaged you guys are in your conversations, but for the sake of needing to get through the presentation, we're gonna gather up. Mr. Bell's gonna share with us what he thinks may be one thing we might need to support these goals.
Money.
Right, so more funding, okay, and how could we use that funding? I heard some ideas over here.
Smaller class sizes, we could reach more students and provide better instructions to smaller groups,
Right,
smaller classes.
right, definitely hard to provide a high quality education when you have 40 plus kids in your classroom and you can't get to each of them, right, and give them that time necessary. So we have time, we have money, smaller classes, what else?
this sounds kind of small time, but I think, you know, the funding thing strikes a bell with me because I know that the students that I have would really benefit from like outings to sites having to do with whatever we're talking about.
Practical experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so like so a different type of teaching that's maybe out of the classroom on
It's
occasion.
more milieu teaching, if you will.
Right, so more well-rounded approach, like a real-world application to the classroom. And that's
You make it real. By visiting a site, you make it real, so.
absolutely, and we're gonna talk more about how we can make history specifically, because this comes from a historical context, absolutely, applicable to all of our kids, as opposed to just focusing on like an American history, or how we can include everybody's ethnic histories and make it relevant and important to them in the classroom. So those are great answers, and obviously, just because we say we need the support doesn't necessarily mean we're gonna get it, but it's the first step in making sure that we're providing social equity in our classrooms. So the next thing we're gonna do is define the key terms. This is kind of a really important understanding because, like we talked about, justice and equity are kind of hard to define, and this really stood out. So equity is the process, and equality is the result. So the process of us teaching has to be equitable teaching, and the students are in turn getting an equal education or having equality as a result. So equity means that all students must be given the real possibility of an equality of outcomes. So we have to provide in our classrooms the opportunity and the possibility that these kids could really achieve at that level. So if you have various kids coming into your classroom at different levels, are you really giving all of them the possibility of achieving the same outcome? That's kind of a scary realization when you take two different kids, maybe a high achiever and a low achiever, like we talked about at the very beginning of the class, and we say, how can we really give them both the real possibility?
How do you measure it?
Well, that's another important question that we're going to get to in regards to legislation. How do you measure, are we providing this, okay? And then finally, an equitable education provides students with what they need to achieve equality. So although this seems, we like to say that we give every student equitable education, they all have equality when it comes to education, but we've all been in classrooms and we know that this isn't always the case, and not every student's given the real possibility of achieving this. So as we move forward, we kind of have to keep that context in mind when it comes to defining those key terms. The next one is social justice. Social justice is defined by treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. It would I would assume that everyone in this classroom would agree that that's something that we all try to achieve in our classrooms, to teach give every kid a fair and equal chance, that we're respectful, that we teach them and give them dignity in regards to also being generous in our classroom. This challenges misconceptions and provides students with the necessary resources and promotes critical thinking environment. If we have kids come into our classroom and we assume things about them, we assume that they're low achievers, we assume that they're not motivated to learn, we assume that they can't do it, we're not giving them the real possibility of achieving equity. Furthermore, we're not treating them with social justice by treating them with these characteristics to make sure that they have an equitable education. So those are fundamental as we move forward. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, dissolving myths. Here are some myths about immigration. The first one is that it's not a phenomenon of the past. You guys are all familiar with that because you are history teachers. But to some, people think that this immigration influx is brand new. We never had immigrants to this country, right? As we know that immigration has changed dramatically, where people are immigrating from and how they immigrate. However, it is not a new phenomenon. Okay, history of all groups must be made visible. From your history textbooks, you know that some history is elevated, given a spotlight, others is kind of brushed under the rug and not really given paid attention to, and this makes it difficult for our students to identify with their culture and their ethnicity because it's not necessarily being made visible in the classroom. Your own heritage influences the way you view your students, how you grew up, how you view education, where you came from in your background. Even though you don't intend it to, it inherently changes the way you view students. Your background does. Even though we don't think it does, we do it every day without really realizing it. So what the social context of multicultural education encourages you to do is to explore the heritages of your students and include them in your lessons and make sure that they feel relevant and welcome in your classroom. Oh, let's go to that question. So the next question is, how can we dissolve myths in our own classroom? And since for sake of time, we're just gonna share out. So if we know that these are some of the myths, like immigration is a new phenomenon, right? Or that history is one-sided, right? It's an American white man's history. What can we do in our classrooms to kind of dissolve these myths?
I make a point of discussing both sides.
Okay, so always give a fair and balanced viewpoint. It's very important.
Try not to wait for certain moments to include like the ethnic or the gender histories. Always try to throw in some women's history, or always try to throw in, like important Black leaders, throughout history, not just wait for February to do that.
Right, so don't wait for a specific section, make it inclusive as you go. It's important. Another thing that they suggest is trying to get to know your students' backgrounds. If we're on winter break, ask them how they celebrate their holidays or what holidays they do share. Letting the other students in the classroom become aware of the differences, because they should be celebrated and not be kind of scared, right, of those differences. So that's a great way to start to dissolve some myths and make students feel more welcome in your classroom.
Ms. Allen, can I share something? I shared with Mr. Bishop being here, was that I used to start all of my classes out with, no one's from Bakersfield, you know what I mean? So how did we all get here?
Mm-hmm.
And really, I talk about history, but you can look at all those movements and kind of discuss what was going on in different parts of the world, and what ultimately led to everyone ending up in this
Place.
fantastic
That's great.
Environmental bastion of culture.
And that's a great way to make your students feel like
But
they're on the process of being
exactly,
treated
right.
equally,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Absolutely.
No one was forced.
That is true.
Forced to say it.
So here are some practices that might hurt us on the process of becoming equitable in our classrooms, okay? The first one's English-only schools. Now, different schools have different policies on second languages being spoke. Your language isn't welcome. If we tell them you can't speak your language at school, it implies that either is your affiliation with that religion or your family or your culture. So once we tell them you can't speak your language, it kind of spirals into other things that they might be counted out. Now, this is kind of a very controversial topic, so we'll kind of try to tread lightly on what our opinions are necessarily on it. But what we do want to bring to light is when we kind of close students' language out, we also close out a lot of things that come with their language. So that's important for us to know. The next one, which is interesting with history specifically, is that curriculum can exclude certain groups of people as a whole, or give a very slanted point on that history. So if it isn't covered, it implies to that student that the group's either not important or not significant in history, when that's really not the case. It might just be that it's not significant in our books, which is an issue that comes to policy, which we'll get to in just a second. Okay, this one says, what changes can you make in your curriculum that challenge these practices? We obviously know as history teachers, there's a lot of things that we can do to our curriculum. If the history book doesn't offer something that the students want to learn about, what could you do in your classroom?
Bring in primary sources, research on your own. And you got to essentially write a chapter of a book yourself, and I guess you have to do that.
Okay, so research.
You could give them guiding questions and so forth, and take them to the library, the internet library, to have them do their own research on the guided questions.
I think that's really great. I know personally, I have a lot of students who say, well, what was Mexico doing at the time? Or what's Mexican history like during that time? Or how did that affect us? And I think in large part our curriculum kind of turns an eye to it, just because it's not really relevant, it's not really a standard, but the students really want to know more about it, which I think shows how they value their culture. And I think as teachers, we have a lot of room to make sure that that's included. So those are great. So as we move forward, we can see that we have a lot of power in our classrooms alone to make sure that we're providing not only an equitable access to an equal education, but as we move forward that we're showing our students how important their background is and how it's not excluded necessarily from their education. So these are all great ways as we move forward to make sure that we're ensuring that we're providing those for our students. Now here's some interesting demographics. The Hispanic population is the largest and fastest growing, they say minority in quotes because no longer the minority group, in the United States. It's projected that by 2050, that people of color, which is kind of a very broad term by the US Census, will make it 54% of the population, no longer making them the minority. Okay, whites are projected to comprise 40% of the population, becoming the new minority. Here's just the shift from current to what is projected in 2050. So you can see what kind of different demographics. I know that people of color is a very broad term. You can thank the U.S. Census data or census data for putting that together. But you can see that it's shifting dramatically as the Hispanic population rises to become a majority in the United States. So what we've kind of seen in the past as a challenge is now moving forward. Okay, we know that there's lots of implications in our classroom. Language, okay, we know that there are students coming to us not having English-speaking families. There's socio-political issues, and we're gonna move on to legislation and policy for the sake of time. Okay, these are 4 legislative policies from the federal government that we've seen. 1965 was the first one we saw, which was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which pretty much said the federal government is going to kind of take the reins when it comes to saying what needs to be done in schools, and they're going to provide the funding that comes with that. We saw that kind of took a dramatic shift, and a very unpopular one in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, where we started seeing accountability coming from standardized tests, annual yearly progress, AYP came into play. A lot of there's a lot of proponents and opponents for No Child Left Behind. I think the majority of the educational community was pretty relieved with the Blueprint from Reform came out in 2010 that said now, okay, we're gonna try to find new ways to assess what's happening in schools if students are succeeding. Okay, and then more recently we have the Common Core State Standards, which have been adopted by most states in 2013 as we make a shift to kind of having more well-rounded education for our kids that's measurable in different ways, and it's more applicable in a real-world context. We know that this comes with its own struggles and benefits as we move forward. Here are some struggles that we know we're facing. Every student isn't getting a high-quality education, okay, despite our effort to do that. Teaching, we know, has shifted, right? What qualifies you to be a teacher? Are teachers qualified to teach the subject matters that they're teaching? Are school cultures being promoted from a federal standpoint? This is really important, guys. Evidence. How do we measure student success? Can we really measure a teacher's capabilities off of students' test scores? Are test scores really measuring what a student's learning? These are huge, huge issues in the educational community, and they I think a lot of times provide like a speed bump for us, if you will, a roadblock as we move forward. But I think as we continue to make sure we are aiming for equitable education in our classrooms, that this will become easier because we will be providing each of our students with an equitable, high-quality education. Community is another one. When we talk about the stakeholders that are involved in education, we oftentimes forget that maybe we have lots of parent support, maybe we have little to no parent support at home, okay? Maybe the community around us isn't engaged in the decision making or isn't engaged in the student learning. So those are also important as we move forward. Okay, so here's the final question. Is policy assisting or hindering you providing a multicultural education to your students? So knowing that these are the policies saying we're going to be tested, the students have to meet this data. Are those policies helping you? Are they hurting you? Do you see a shift between No Child Left Behind and Common Core State Standards? What's the shift? What's your guys' opinion? Policy, legislative policy.
I mean, I think it depends on from which school you come from. For school for us, you know, we have students that are at, you know, the 8th grade reading level, and we're trying to hold them to a senior state standard, you know, but we can't, it's scaffolded for a reason. We can't go from this to this in one big jump, you know. I think it depends on the school in which you're in, and as far as the policymakers, you know, I found that a lot of the policymakers aren't even in education, so.
Which is a very valid point. Education isn't one size fits all, right? So you can't fit a kid who's been learning English for 1 year or a kid who has trouble reading to the accountability of a student who hasn't had any of those obstacles.
And plus, we have the highest, out of all the Kern County schools, we have the highest population of kids that are the, what do they call them, resource kids or
Title I.
Title I, but not just Title I. I'm talking about kids
Oh, special ed.
Special
We have a
ed.
high population of special education, right?
I mean, kids aren't even at 8th grade level that I teach. I gave them assignments last Thursday and Friday of writing, and I had more problems with their, with them acting out,
Mhm.
with their, because they couldn't handle it. They were just so upset.
Struggled, right?
They were overwhelmed and they acted out, and
Yeah, we are pressed, because we need to meet them where they are, but where they are isn't always, obviously, where we expect them to be or where we need them to be for our curriculum, so. Has
Right.
it gotten a little easier? Possibly. I think maybe it's gotten a little bit easier with Common Core because it's not as rigorous yet. In other words, we don't have to necessarily skip over their own cultures,
Mhm.
but, I'm sure.
Those are all very important. So now that we understand the context, this is my call to action for you. We know that there are obstacles in our way, but we know that our goal is to provide a high quality, equal education and social justice for everybody. So teachers must do their very best to ensure that educational equity is not an illusion, but an achievable goal in our classrooms. So despite the obstacles, we know that we can give an equitable education to students with the right support, okay? So we have a multicultural society and this demands a multicultural education. So as you move forward in your classes, I urge you to try to use these concepts that we've gone over today to maybe better guide your curriculum and the way you approach students. And I hope that this has been helpful in understanding the multicultural context of education. So thank you.